My name is James Trost, and this is A2 Insight. Today's guest is Emeritus Professor George Wieland of the University of Michigan. Dr. Wieland received his bachelor's degree in psychology from Stanford University and his PhD from the University of Michigan in social psychology. George Wieland, welcome to A2 Insight.
It's a pleasure.
Well, we're very glad to have you here. I'd like you to start off by giving us a little bit of information about your background, where you grew up, early influences, your family, and we'll kind of go there in terms of what you've done with your life academically. So let us know.
Okay, well, I'm a native of New York City. I worked very hard getting rid of my accent, but one time I heard Governor Nelson Rockefeller speaking on the radio, and he had a New York accent. So I thought, well, of course, by that time I'd gotten rid of my accent. And of course, he had more money than I did, so he could do whatever he wanted. So it was either New York City or nearby New Jersey. And I grew up with a lot of refugees from New York City. We were all first-generation Americans, wanted to be very American. There were Hungarians and Italians and all different ethnic groups. And that started me thinking about cultures, different cultures. Well, my parents always spoke English at home, and maybe that helped, because I think some people, they have two different worlds. They have the world in the school and outside the home, and they speak English, and in the home they speak their foreign language. But in my case, it was English in both situations. And then I started to realize it's English, but my parents have different values. They had different things that they believed in. Different things were important. And that was my beginning insight in culture. That my parents had, even though they spoke English, they had a different culture.
And that culture was German, is that right? In terms of where when your family came here initially, you were from Germany, is that right? Or what culture was different?
Yeah, they came in the 1920s. I'm always grateful, before the Nazis and before the war and all that. But they had grown up over there. They went to school. They both had only 7 grades of education, which was typical of peasant or farm families. But they were German. But they were Swabian, actually. And as we get into this, I will talk about the differences, some of the differences. Well, one difference actually was the fact that my mother was short, brunette, brown eyes, brown hair, and on my father's side, we go back, the Icelandic sagas mention the Wielands. So it's a different heritage. But on my mother's side, it was more Swabian. And when I went into the research on Swabian origins, that's how I became aware of the Celts. And I attribute her being brunette and other Germans in the South being brunette and short, not all of them, but many of them, having this, they interbred with the Celts for a number of generations. So that kind of helped. Once I started research, I became aware of a lot of things about my parents that I wasn't aware of initially. So the beginning of this thing was visiting relatives. living in England, I could easily visit Germany. So I visited relatives, had many cousins over there. And we were walking in this small town, we were walking past a bookstore, and a cousin said, "Oh, we're Swabians here," and she pointed to a book, Deutschland, deine Schwaben, Germany, your Swabians. And when I read that book, a lot of things, it was very thorough, and it explained about the emphasis on religion and spirituality, the conscientiousness and frugality of the Swabians, and the very independent-mindedness of the Swabians. Those are kind of, well, there's a fourth trait that's common there, and that's music. Music's very important for the Swabians. So the book really, I had to work my way through it slowly because my German was high school German.
Sure.
But the book got me started. Suddenly there was all this information that I hadn't been aware of about my parents and other Swabian relatives.
Well, that's interesting, and again, this does kind of lead to exactly why we're interviewing Professor Wieland, and that is to discuss this specific book, which is Celtic Germans, particularly as it relates to Ann Arbor. This is the rise and fall of Ann Arbor's Swabians. Since this is a local program, we want to discuss things that are relevant, and historically what a lot of people don't know is the strong German influence of Ann Arbor. And so I guess my first question to you concerning the German experience here in Ann Arbor, why did the Swabians, or the Germans in general, choose Ann Arbor as a region to emigrate from in the 1840s, I believe is the start?
Yeah, the Swabians are unique in Germany in that they have an inheritance practice where each boy or each male in the family gets a share of the farm. So over the generations, farmers had less and less land because each generation they're splitting it up. Whereas other parts of Germany, the oldest son or the youngest son would inherit to keep the farm in the family. So there was this great hunger for land, and there was also a potato famine, not as bad as the Irish, but so this was the early 19th century, and at that point, Michigan was opening up. Ohio had been settled a little earlier. People came from Pennsylvania, but the Germans went to New York City, and then they took it. Later on, there were trains, but they would take canal boats. They would come across Lake Erie, and here was, you could get a farm of 100 acres if you worked away at it, saved your money. And so the Swabians, about 80% of the Germans in Ann Arbor and around Ann Arbor were from Swabia. There were some from North Germany, from Westphalia and other places. So Ann Arbor was unique in that, people would write back to neighbors and family members, "Hey, great opportunity, in America." So there was this chain migration. Later I did some research, actually, that appears in this book in a town in Nebraska, and the same thing happened there. The Swabians wrote back to family members, and it became a very Swabian town in the middle of Nebraska. So this happened elsewhere in the U.S., chain migration. Some towns are Saxon, and some towns are something else. So Michigan was opening up, and west of town there was a lot of land. The Germans either well, initially they would work on a farm, and then they saved their money, very frugal people, and bought land. So west of town, the plat maps, the farm maps, show German. I have a map in the book. German names, last names are almost, it's homogeneous almost, because gradually Americans or English, whatever their heritage, usually English, or from New York State. Many people came from New York State here, and that created problems later.
Well, and that does lead to this. Here come the Germans, and at the time they were referred to, the other Americans were referred to as the English, I believe, by the Germans.
Yes.
How did and in the 19th century initially, how did the Germans and the English in Ann Arbor get along?
Yeah, well, that's because the English were from New York State, and many upper New York State, not New York City, their families came from New England, and so they had this Puritan heritage, and that created problems. Alcohol, even music was a problem. The Swabians believed in working like other Germans, working hard all week. You go to church on Sunday, and then Sunday afternoon you have a great time, you know. There are brass bands, and there's drinking, and for these puritanical people, that was awful. In fact, as late as 1875, the state Presbyterian organization and the state Methodist organization chastised the Germans for desecrating Sunday. So music on Sunday was, Sunday was supposed to be solemn. Actually, I understand that the American churches didn't have much in the way of music except for the Psalms, and only gradually did they introduce hymns, whereas in Germany, supposedly Martin Luther took the tunes of drinking songs and created hymns. So music was on Sunday in the services, and in general, music was very important for the Swabians. When I visit my relatives, there's usually one or more kids are learning an instrument. And in fact, I gathered some survey data and national survey data in Germany, and that was one of the differences between the Swabians and other Germans, that music was more important. More were learning an instrument, or more belonged to singing societies. I don't know where it came from, but maybe supposedly the Celts were very musical, but that was a long time ago.
Sure. Well, that's an interesting, having grown up in Ann Arbor, music and the Ann Arbor public school system particularly, music is a major aspect. It's one of the best programs in the country, has been for decades.
Yes, it's gotten awards, national awards.
It was expected you learn an instrument. I mean, it wasn't an option, as I recall, when I was in 5th grade. But let's move on to later. Now, the University of Michigan comes to Ann Arbor. We have a division street. I don't know if you know the etymology, why we call it. Is dividing between what is the question?
Yeah,
Did you ever find that out?
I don't really know. Somebody like Grace Shackman might have an answer to that, local historian Grace. But at one point, it was a division that east of Ann Arbor, alcohol could be, west of division, alcohol could be served, but not east, because the university was located east. But that was only a brief time, and I think the name Division Street came, very early. Don't know.
Well, Well, that's interesting. I guess I'd like to move on to attitudes in the 20th century as the integration takes place between the Germans and the English, and they become more American. But there were German parochial schools, there were German language papers in Ann Arbor, and then we have World War I, and attitudes towards German Americans changed. And could you give me an update of what it was like to be a German in 1917 in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, I guess it was pretty traumatic. Muslims today have a problem, but Germans, in my book, I've got cartoons from Life magazine, and starting in 1915 already, there were derogatory cartoons about Germans. There was this great antipathy toward Germans. It developed slowly, because we didn't get into the war until when? 1918?
17.
1917, okay. So it developed slowly, but there was a lot. There was even a German lynched in, I think it was Illinois. So in the book, I have a couple advertisements, illustrations of advertisements from a newspaper. And at the end of 1917, the German newspaper changed everything, including even ads, changed to English. So there was a German language ad for the Michigan Union Brewery. That was the big brewery on the Old West Side. And the ad extolled the healthful virtues. Beer was very good for you, and it's pure, etc. The January 1918, the ad was in English, and it emphasized, instead of the healthful aspects of it, emphasized, we deliver anywhere in town. So I think everything, even the society columns, changed to English. It was people, as I describe in the book, people couldn't speak German in public because others would point, and actually that happened in World War II. People in New York City, German Jews who were refugees, told me that they didn't dare speak German in public, on the subway or out on the sidewalk anywhere, because there were so many Eastern European Jews, and they were raised with Yiddish, which is a dialect of German. And when they heard somebody speaking German, they thought immediately, here is one of those hated Germans, even though these were German refugees, German Jewish refugees. So speaking German was very difficult. The churches tried to, even though there were some parishioners that, the women who didn't know English yet, they had to hear sermons in English. The German Methodist Church changed its name to the West Side. It's on it's off of Pauline and Maple. So there were great changes in World War I. There's a funny thing. People talk about the school on the Old West Side, and they call it Baugh School. It's B-A-C-H. And I always wondered about that. And then the thought came to me, if you say Bach, which the way a German or German American would pronounce it, that would point you out as somebody who was German. And my hypothesis is that it became Baugh School instead of Bach.
Right. Well, unfortunately for the Germans, the struggles internationally are continuing as we move into the 30s. But I think after World War I, given the entire language, German schools, German newspapers were completely gone. And a lot of Germans certainly felt, rightfully so, the Versailles Treaty was a disaster. Certainly Wilson did. We didn't join the League of Nations. What was the attitude of the German Americans or the Swabian Americans in Ann Arbor, I would say in the 30s, up to the start of World War II, particularly to the rise of Nazi Germany and the remarkable gains, at least it seemed, of getting back at what was an unjust ending to World War I? Did you do any research on the German attitudes, at least towards Nazi Germany, prior to what we learned later was going on in the start of World War II?
I suspect most Germans were like my parents. You were grateful that you had work here, you could earn good money, you could afford to buy a house. It was a good living. So there were Germans. It was called the German-American Bund, and they even had a big rally in Madison Square Garden. And many of them were immigrants that had come over very briefly before in 1920s. So, but I had a friend in Buffalo who's now passed away, a Swabian friend, and I used to stop and visit, and we got to know each other. But eventually, after much time, and after a lot of beers, we were talking, and he got extremely irate, explaining about the Versailles Treaty, how Germany lost all its colonies, there were reparations, Germany had to admit full guilt for starting the war. Part of Germany was occupied by the Allies. So the Versailles Treaty was awful, and I guess I could understand how some Germans like him might have been sympathetic toward Hitler. Hitler was aware of this. Well, it was a great shame. Germany had become the second most economic power in the world. So suddenly World War I, they lost, and the humiliation. So I can understand how, I guess at its maximum, maybe there were 25,000 members of the German-American Bund, and it was an East Coast phenomenon. Here in Ann Arbor, people were, well, many Germans here were several generations already, so they didn't have this experience of the World War I and the great shame of Versailles. So my parents they liked America. That's why they only spoke English at home. They wanted to be American.
Well, that does lead to, again, the Germans now were after World War II, and the German character is still present in town. There were several bars off the other side of Division Street. But we also run into a rather turbulent time in the 60s, and I would assume for a very hardworking, individualistic, maybe somewhat believe in authoritative aspects of society and government, they may not have found the rising civil rights and Vietnam anti-war sentiment particularly a pleasant scene. So what was the attitude towards the Ann Arbor Germans during the late 60s and early 70s and the traumatic period of time for them?
Yeah, well, Germans typically, I've looked at national survey data in the US, and German Americans vote Republican. And all of the German American presidents have been Republicans. Eisenhower, Hoover, who else? Well, the latest one, Dutch, he was called Dutch Reagan because he was half German. But the latest one is Trump. He's German American. So German Americans are Republican, and so I was working in England during the turbulent 70s, but I can imagine that, you know, the hash bash and all the other the violence going on. I think that's one of the reasons, you know, Ann Arbor became very democratic after the university expanded, and I think student enrollment was tripled, and many staff were hired who were liberal, and I think that's why a lot of the German Americans moved out of town. They went, well, Germans like greenery. They like the countryside, so they moved to the suburbs, the townships. So there aren't that many German Americans left in town. I mean, there's the restaurants, but actually the Heidelberg is owned by, I think it's an Arab family maybe. The girls in that family weren't interested in running a restaurant, the Heidelberg. Let's see, we have Metzger's, which is out on Zeebrode now. And I would suggest people go and look at the wall there. There's some newspaper clippings at what happened to Bill Metzger during Prohibition. He had a hard time. Some of his cider fermented, and he had a very difficult time. So, and when you walk into that restaurant, there's a beautiful wooden carving that he commissioned in Germany. It has a German saying, something to the effect, "Good eating and drinking you will never forget." So, so that's a sort of a museum there. And let's see, we have any other German restaurants? The Old German is now the new Old German. It's in the basement of Grizzly Peak. But the Old German was a long time a favorite place. Sure. I should mention some of the museums people can go to. There is the Kempf House on Division, and the Kempfs, he taught piano, she taught voice, an example of the Swabian love of music. There's a tiny museum at the corner of Washington and First Street. There's a 5-story brick building there, and that used to be the piano, Allmendinger piano and organ factory. Employed lots of people, and then World War I came and they couldn't export their pianos to Europe, to Germany anymore. But at the corner of First and Washington, there's a tiny museum with examples of their products that they manufactured. Well, 2 other museums are farm museums that people might want to go to. There's the Rentschler Farm Museum in Saline, and that family farmed until the middle of the 20th century, and then they gradually sold off land as Saline expanded and people complained about the smell of animals and noise of animals. So that's a farm museum. And then there's the Waterloo Farm Museum in Waterloo, and that's a 19th century, mid-19th century home that's furnished in that era. It's really nice, and that family was very prosperous. And as the family died off, the children never married, and the state was going to take it over, and neighbors decided we're going to make a museum out of it. So they have Pioneer Day and other events out there. So it's a nice day trip to go out there and spend some time at that museum.
Well, that's wonderful. I think it's important for those watching to understand and know more about the history of Ann Arbor and the various different ethnic groups that did come here. We have a couple of minutes left, Dr. Wieland. I'd like you to just let our audience know. I know that you're doing a variety of research projects currently, and if you would like to just explain briefly a little bit about the other publications you have currently that our audience may be interested in purchasing.
Okay.
Why don't you just tell a little bit about your books?
Yes, this is the next book after Celtic Germans, and it's Stubborn and Liking It, and it's about Einstein, Bertolt Brecht, who they were Swabians. There's a chapter about the farmers in Nebraska, chapters about Jews who were very stubborn and refused to leave despite the Nazi abuse. So it's all about stubbornness, but I would emphasize stubbornness in a good way, in that you're committed to what you're doing. So the next book is also about Swabians, and this is oral history. I've interviewed a lot of people on the East Coast, where there are many more Swabians than there are in Ann Arbor. And they told me about, again, the Jews and what happened during the Nazi period. People who came after the war, they were called war brides. That is, American soldiers brought them over. And they were able to tell me about the bombing and the awful time during the war and after the war. Germany was destitute. The bombing was, there was carpet bombing, just consistently across the city, because targeted bombing was not very accurate. So these oral history stories are very interesting. It's everyday people who experienced Germany, starting in the 1920s, my parents' generation, 1930s, German Jews, several Jews who survived the death camps, post-war immigrants who had a lot to say about the war and how awful it was. So these are, all three are available at the bookstore at Westgate, Nicola's, and there's also another bookstore, Bookbound, on Plymouth. It's a wonderful young couple opened a bookstore there, the Blackshear family, and I hope they make a go of it. And they told me, well, they're the only bookstore on the north side of town, so maybe they have an advantage.
Well, we certainly wish you the best of luck in your research going forward and the success of these books. Professor Wieland, thank you so much for coming on A2 Insight. And again, for A2 Insight, I'm James Trost. Until next time.